I would like to welcome you to the second class of the UBC Ecosystem Modeling course. Today we're going to have a lecture by Beth Fulton, and I'm really pleased to welcome Beth to give a lecture about ecosystem modeling, highlights, applications, and gaps. And by means of introduction, I'm pulling something out of my sleeve here because I'm going to ask Carl Walters if he would give an introduction to Beth. Carl.
So I don't know if you can see Beth's picture there, but Beth's sitting in a truck. And the reason she's sitting in a truck is that she's isolated on her farm with her family and her animals. And she has to drive up to the top of a mountain apparently to get an internet signal from there. She can't go into her office in Hobart. Anyway, it's a huge honor to introduce Beth. Just first thing I'll say is that Beth is the world's top ecosystem analyst and modeler, bar none, no question about it. She is number one everywhere. My first introduction to Beth came when I was the external examiner for her doctoral dissertation at the University of Tasmania, where she compared a bunch of ecosystem models, particularly different ecopath models with different complexity, recognizing that trying to understand the ecosystem and using models isn't a matter of building a model and seeing if it works. It's a matter of comparing alternatives to see what you can learn from each of those alternatives, and to look at issues like how much detail do you need, how much complexity do models need to have. Nobody has explored that kind of question more than Beth. She's worked with Ecopath, Ecosim, like Billy and I work with. She's developed a modeling system called Atlantis, an agent-based system that allows much more complex spatial modeling in particular than anybody else has done. So she's worked with just about every approach you can imagine. Uh, I have to tell one little anecdote here. So Beth grew up on a New South Wales farm, complete with some Aboriginal ancestry. And when they discovered as a young girl that she was a little smarter than everybody else, they sent her off to Britain to school to study mathematics and such things, where she did really remarkable things like becoming a shooter for British rich Brits who went out to hunt red deer in the Highlands of England and Scotland. So she's had an amazingly remarkable background in field biology and mathematics and modeling. And I think you'll thoroughly enjoy the perspectives that she offers you today. Beth, most welcome.
Thank you very much, Carl. I actually think that you aren't quite right, as usual, about everything you say. Beth, I think you spent quite a bit of time while you did your PhD at UBC. So Carl's first introduction to you was actually at that point. That's not important compared to all the rest you talked about. So Beth, let me hand over to you, and I'm ready. If you give me a next, I will move move
Right,
things
thanks,
along here.
Billy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carl. That was as embarrassing as usual. I'll give you an Australian welcome this morning, not just g'day or good morning, but I'd like to acknowledge the elders of the lands that we meet on today in our various parts of the world. The elders, the custodians of the land, past, present, and future. I think they have a really systemic vision of the way that they look at the world, and it's something that we can learn from and draw on as we make ecosystem models. So an ecosystem, I'm going to give you literally the highlights of ecosystem modeling this morning. It's hard to go into depth. It's like usually a week or more's course intensive when I teach here in Australia. So I'm just going to touch on the top parts. So next, Billy.
There we are.
So we already can forecast at lots of different scales to help people make decisions. So not just in fisheries, but in daily life as well, like traffic lights and stuff like that. But in terms of fisheries and aquaculture, you know, there's some predictions that are made on hours to days scale for aquaculture around what they need to be doing in feed for seasonal and monthly levels. It's around the equipment needed, the location, what they're actually going to harvest or target. A lot of the models I'm going to talk about today sit in the years to decades scale, where you're helping people think about what they need to do to keep the system sustainable over the sort of the next 5 to 10 or even 50 years. And that's become increasingly important under climate change because things are moving around in ways that we don't necessarily understand. So we need guidance and insight to anticipate that and set ourselves up appropriately. So it's not just about helping efficiency and planning investment, but it's actually acknowledging the core connections within the system so that we can keep it all sustainable. Next, please. And it's particularly important around balancing trade-offs. The human brain is not well set up to balance things that are really different. So if it's two things that are very similar, like what kind of sandwich you want for lunch, we're really good at that. But if you're trying to balance off, you know, something like economics and cultural desires around your traditional lands or the connections in an ecosystem, we're not very good at balancing that off at all. So we need some extra support tools to help us do it. And that's where ecosystem models come in. Next, please. Now, the ecosystem models that we play with cover 14 orders of magnitude, or 14 to 16 orders of magnitude, depending on what you're looking at. Now, that's quite a lot, and many people would question why you need that many scales considered, from the bacterial scale to processes that happen on the scale of the entire climate or the ocean basin. And that's because the processes themselves that we have to worry about, the ecosystem processes, cover 10 orders of magnitude. But even a fisheries or coastal manager who's looking after a single stock or a single beach, they're covering about 4 orders of magnitude. So you've got to set the context for them to get all the influences that are actually directly affecting what they're thinking about. So you do need to think across all of those scales. And that's why the complexity angle, thinking about what's the best way of doing that, is super important when you put one of these models together. Next, please. In my personal motivation, I was asked by my mentor, Tony Smith, to get into this because he was being asked questions from fisheries managers and others who wanted to know what's going on. It's not as easy as in the land world of just walking out and seeing what's there. In the ocean, a lot is hidden. So we have to use models to help piece that together, particularly in places where there's not as much data. And Australia actually sits in that group. We don't collect as much data for the water area that we have. So these models became a critical part of piecing together the information that we have. So you have to use it well and use it smart if you don't have exhaustive information about what you're trying to think about. Next, please. And that's important because decisions can have really long-lasting effects. So in terms of Australia, on the left-hand side here, we have some deep water corals that take hundreds to thousands of years to grow. And on the right-hand side, you can see what looks like a set of car tracks going off into the distance. That's actually the footprint of a trawler going through this kind of habitat. So that's a fairly light footprint for this one. I've seen ones where you've got really strong corals and then a big trough has been dug out that's meters deep. Fishermen don't actually like to do that. Their gear is quite expensive these days, but it's also something you have to understand around those effects so that you can help guard against them, but you can also help people make sustainable livelihoods without leaving that footprint. So you can both provide information on what the effects are, but then pull that information together to provide future options to give everybody a better go at it so that you're economically viable, you're socially fulfilled, and you've got your sustainability on the conservation and ecology side. Next, please. So that's why we get into it. So what is ecosystem modeling? For many people, it's just the stuff in the center there, the food web connections amongst the biological parts. And that's perfectly acceptable. That's fine just to think about that part. That's quite a lot to do in its own right. But it can also build in that bigger picture of how is the environment influencing that food web, And how does that food web sit into the bigger human web of connections and influences? The key part, whether you just go for the food web part or you go for the entire socio-ecological part, is to include the interactions and processes that are happening. So who's feeding on who, how's it flowing back? There's a fair few one-way arrows in that food web. That's not actually true. There's a lot of two-way arrows in food webs as well. But you'll notice there's lots of two-way arrows in the human part, and that's because we both influence the ecosystem and we're structured by it. And it's that two-way flow that's particularly important to think about when you think about ecosystems. Next, please. So I'm going to give you a lightning walkthrough of 100 years of ecosystem modeling. When you get into reading about in the literature, it's confusing because there's two different chains that call themselves ecosystem models. The first is around plankton, and they started writing models in the 30s and 40s. Next, please. And by the 50s to 60s, it was still largely plankton modeling. It had become slightly more spatially complex and added in extra dimensions across this very simple map of what's in an ecosystem. Next, please. By the 70s to 80s, you're starting to see the first food web models that include fish, but it starts in its own right separately. So this is why you have two competing worlds, or not competing, two different worlds that call themselves ecosystem models, which can make it hard when you're tracking down information, but we can also learn from each other. So in the 70s and 80s, they were fairly simple models just showing connections. And this is the time that Ecopath with Ecosim started up. Next, please, Willie. In the 90s, it became the plankton models didn't go in for adding too much extra to their models. They just went into refining the skill and how accurate they were and the processes involved, whereas the food web models started to grow their dimensions quite large, starting to really bring in the human component. Next, please. In the 2000s, when I started to do most of my modeling, you can see that the ecosystem part that we think about, the fish part, has got wider and wider, whereas the plankton world is a little bit of a few additions, but it's just getting more intense in how they cope with the fine scale detail of the part of the system that they're thinking about. But they go into quite a lot of detail. They'll have 13 to 15 kinds of phytoplankton, whereas in the food web models that we talk about, we might have anywhere between 1 to 5 or 6, but we don't go into the same degree of detail. So the two worlds have largely split. Next, please. So by the time we get to 2000, the last decade, a third kind of model's kind of been added. And this is the socio-ecological model I talked about before, where you've given that huge perspective of what's happening on the human side. So you can either do that really broad and thin, so you're not going into much detail about anything, or next one. Or you can go deep on key factors, and that's called models of intermediate complexity of ecosystems, or MICE. So they pull out the key players and they go into quite a lot of detail just on those. And that'll go from the environment to, say, the target species, its predator and prey, and then the human fleet around it, but they just don't go in that shallow, thin depth over everything. Either way is a fine approach. It depends on the question that you're asking. Next, please. So there's kind of three different ways of using models. There's the conceptual model just for understanding, and that can be literally a picture drawn on a piece of paper of what's connected to what and what's driving what. There's models that are tactical on a year-to-year decision-making process, like setting an allowable catch for a fishery. And there's strategic planning models that have a bigger picture. I'll probably talk more about that last kind, the strategic planning kind, and the conceptual models, less about the tactical models. But there are beginning to be ecosystem models used at all of these stages, less so on a tactical stage, but they are starting to happen. And you can actually use them in a deployment and a staged approach. I think everybody who does a strategic model will probably go through a conceptual model first, but you can actually use all three and stage them one at a time, typically going conceptual, strategic, and then tactical, interestingly enough, but they are interconnected. And the best part is that you can use them as a test bed for looking at your options, because it doesn't matter if you screw up the ecosystem in your computer, it's better than doing it in the real world, so that people can get all those mistakes and unintended consequences out on your pretend model without affecting the real world. Next, please. So regardless of what kind of model you're trying to build, you pull in data from different types. So lots of people think about the industry data, like the fisheries data, or the biological data about abundance and habitats, and how that information flows through the scientists and the managers into qualitative and quantitative models. But you can actually draw on other information systems too, from the local community who live in the area and understand it, and the traditional owners who actually have a deep time knowledge of how the system has been, in my case, over the last 85,000 years. So there's stories in the cultures of Australia that can tell us about how ecosystems were 65 to 80,000 years ago. And they can do that because they mention, we know it's on those timescales because they mention geological features that we can date. So you get a very different perspective when you pull in that really deep knowledge, and the stories that they tell can tell you about the patterns that those ecosystems were going under for thousands of years before they were touched by the last few hundred years, in my case, of white European settlement and how that's changed the system. So you can get an insight into what the systems can support. Next, please. So there's 3 different parts to putting models together, and a guy called Richard Levins figured this out or published about it in the 1960s. There's precision, there's generality and how easy it is transferable from one place to another. And then there's how much realism and detail that you get into. You can't cover all 3 in one model. It's just impossible. It just doesn't work. So there's different kinds of models. There's qualitative models where you're going for sort of general principles about real world systems. And because you're not tying in numbers in a sort of explicit quantitative sense, you can bring those 2 parts together. And that's different to a statistical model where you're after fine scale precision because it's being driven totally by the data you're on. Some of those models can transfer place to place, but they don't have detailed mechanisms behind them. They're just following patterns in the data. So that means they're hard to get the realism that allows you to forecast under uncertain circumstances, like under climate change, or take that data out of, take those relationships outside the data that they were created from. There's also mechanistic models where you try to put your ecological and other understanding together to give you those realism, the dynamics that will allow you to project into the future or the deep past, and you can do that with some level of precision. So you've got those 3 different ways of looking at the world. And Richard Levins and actually also Pablo Picasso both talk about painting an understanding of the world through the intersection of independent light. So if you can, no model is the absolute truth. We can't know the absolute truth because we have to filter everything through data collection, mathematics, and our own mental capacity. So there's always a filter between us and truth. So it's some form of lie, so to speak. But if you can get multiple different models to be giving you a similar answer, particularly when they start from different starting points, then you can be pretty confident that you're on the right track. If they actually disagree, that's also useful information because it highlights where you don't understand things and what kind of information you need to go out and collect to help you refine that understanding and give you a firmer base for making decisions. Next, please. So in top of all of the other ways I've chopped up models so far, there's one more way that's worth thinking about. So that's how you actually do the mathematics behind them. So the first way is a qualitative way. It's where you literally draw sort of balls and connected by arrows. And that's where you're just saying that's called a sign digraph, and knowing whether that's a positive or negative interaction. So is it a predator that's gaining from the interaction or a prey that's suffering? Just knowing even that amount of mathematics allows you to connect the system up in a way that if you push on one part of it, you can predict how the other parts of the system respond with about an 80 to 90% correct outcome at the present moment. So that's a pretty powerful way when you can't get other data together to help you refine it into a quantitative model. Within the quantitative models, there's kind of a few large classes. There's one that uses sort of classical mathematics, whether that's statistical modeling or whether that's differential and difference equations that you might have done in calculus. They're kind of formal statistical models. For those people interested in machine learning and AI, they sit in the statistical model realms. They're really just fancy statistics. So they still use those classical mathematical approaches. In the decision trees are a completely different branch altogether. They use heuristic rules of if this happens, then do that. They're the mathematics that sit around behind how your computer operates and how, video game operates, but they can also be used quite powerfully to look at how ecosystems work. Next, please. You can also stitch the models together in different ways. So if you look at all the terms of ecosystem models in the literature, you get a lot of different ways of putting the different parts of an ecosystem together. So I've very loosely clumped up on the left-hand side there the different parts of an ecosystem. When I first started, and it's still true today in part, you can see that the fisheries world and the pelagic primary production physics world didn't connect. They can be expanded as they have through time. In that little discussion we had a moment ago about the last 100 years, you can see that they can expand to cover more of that space, and in some cases they'll start to connect up. Often in the mice world, the models of intermediate complexity, they'll put focus on the fish and have less of a focus on the tail ends of physics and the higher trophic levels or the human parts. Whether they do that really thinly, as in the fourth bar along, or whether they do it in a fat way, where they put a lot of more into the plankton and fish communities with very light touches on physics and humans. You can also create models that have a similar resolution the whole way down, and that's some of those thin, big system thin models that I spoke about. There's two other approaches. One is particularly you came out of the plankton world. It's called the rhomboid approach, where you pick some key players and you put a lot of detail on that key player and the connections either side of it, and then you chain those kind of key players up through the system. It's been done more in the plankton world, so it doesn't often have the fisheries and human parts, but it is a valid approach of doing that. And then there's the last approach, which for me has been the most useful one, and that's a hybrid approach where you actually think about all of the different parts of the ecosystems and what's the best mathematical representation of those different parts of the system. And they can actually even be different in different parts of the life history. So you can have differential equations for things that are beautifully covered by analytical mathematics, and that's often where you have quite a lot of small things like microbes and bacteria. And then you can have size structured parts for where that works well, particularly in mesopelagic fishes. In habitats, you can start to bring in metapopulations and what they call cellular automata. And then when you get into fisheries or top predators, where their individual identity and the decisions they make are important because there's few of them, or they can change quite substantially, that's when you can get into what's called an individual approach that uses more of those kind of decision trees rather than classical equations. Next one, please. So there's lots of ways of chopped up modeling there based on what kind of detail it's got in it, what kind of equations it uses, and you can bring those together in equally many diverse ways. So there's quite a toolbox of approaches in ecosystem modeling now, and I would encourage people who've got the capacity to work across as many as possible. So because they actually come from different ways about thinking about an ecosystem. So if you really can get multiple models to come to similar conclusions with such different backgrounds, then you are pretty sure that you're on the right track. So if we look at statistical distributions first, so next one, please, Billy. There where you take a proxy for that is easy to measure, so something like depth or temperature, and you use that to predict things that you actually care about, such as the distribution of different kinds of fish, where there might be hotspots of production of, say, small pelagics, or where there might be the most demersal fish or the most diverse range of demersal fish. We do this a lot in Australia where we just don't have enough data, but it is a valid way of thinking about ecosystems. Next one, please, Philly. The next one is the species distributions, and that's the kind of thing that William Chung does, where you look at physiological details and tolerances, what kind of temperatures do they like, what habitats, what primary production, and you use that to track their most likely locations. And then you think about an ecosystem by layering up all of the different species in that way. So it has a connections to the environment and to production, but not necessarily to each other just yet. Next one is size traits, and that's used to observe and create patterns and its basic assumption is that small things grow into big things eat small things, and also reproduce into small things. That's kind of the classic set of assumptions behind it. It can become a lot more elaborate about details and traits, about how big they get, what really is the range that they eat, and things like that. But it's a very rapid way of getting to look at an ecosystem. It's becoming what I would call an ecosystem assessment model, in the sense that we're using it as a rapid deployment tool to ask questions across different kinds of ecosystems. And you can do it really effectively because a lot of the ecology of oceans does have strong size structuring into it. So it is a really effective way of thinking about the world. Next one, please. The next one is the one that has been done the most, and so it is the most well understood. It's a food web approach of who eats who. Ecopath with Ecosim, I'm not up on the statistics as much as I used to be, but there's hundreds to thousands of, I think hundreds of users and thousands of applications. And so it's a really well known way of doing things. And it is super powerful if it's used intelligently, but like any model, any of these models, you have to be careful how you use the tools. Intermediate complexity is the next one, please, Philly. And that's about picking out those key important bits and focusing on them. And then they use the same kind of statistical methods that they use to fit stock assessment models to really closely fit them to observational historical data. So that's why they're kind of the one model in this group so far that's used in a tactical sense to set quotas, though some of the other models are beginning to be used in that way too. The next one, which is the Bayesian networks, it's about laying out all the connections in a system and saying, if I have the prey and it changes by this much, this is the probability of how the predator responds. So it's a good way of bringing together lots of information from different sources. It's classically well known for being able to bring together information from the human side of the system, communities, fisheries data, environment. But it has one thing that you have to be particularly careful about. It doesn't do well in representing feedbacks. The mathematics can't cope with that. So you can trick it into looking at feedbacks. You can do it in a sneaky way by chaining networks, but you have to be a little bit careful because that can get quite complicated. But it is a good way of creating those semi-quantitative conceptual models of the understanding and connections. Then the last one, next please, really, is how you create a mosaic of methods together. So that's where I was talking about you bring the individual based and differential equations and stuff together. Whatever works best for each bit, basically. So that whole toolbox gives you a huge range and capacity to look at ecosystems that you can tailor to the amount of information that you've got available and the time that you've got available. Next, please, Philly. And that's where you've got the key part about being the modeler is that you will get to understand the system in a way that no one else does. You get the big picture view. That means that you have to create a model that's fit for purpose. And that means working very closely, back one step. Yep, thanks. Very closely with what you're doing. So the objectives and context that you have to deliver into. There's no point making the absolutely beautiful model that doesn't answer the question that the manager actually has, because they're never going to use it. They're flat out using it even when it does answer what they're after. So you need to be providing information on what they want. You also need to be very conscious of the available information and don't stretch too far. You can have that uncertainty. You can say, look, we don't know, but it's most likely this value, but you have to be really clear about that. So always pretend that you're going to be audited so that you can chain and point to why you've ended up with the structure of the model that you've got, what data was used to create that, so that you can always switch in other things if required. So it's not just about what you can do, it's about what you actually need. And hopefully you can find an overlap between those so that you can make it serviceable. Next, please. Now, I'm not going to go into huge detail about this table, but there was a paper I was on that came out last year that was on your reading list. And we tried to summarize in there across land and sea, because the land way of modeling ecosystems also developed separately to the sea way of modeling the ecosystems. We're trying to bring the two together to see what lessons we could learn. So this table here tries to summarize for anyone who's new to modeling all the different kinds of models that are out there and have been used in ecosystem modeling questions, and when they are most commonly used. That's not to say you can't use some of the models in places that haven't more commonly been used if you're smart and you're in the right circumstance. But if they're rarely used for something, it's usually because they're not very good at it. So it's also a little bit of a cautionary tale of if you're going to take it to that kind of application, such as ecosystem condition and state for a conceptual model, then you have to be pretty smart about how you do it. And it's probably going to be really tough to do. So you might not want to do it, particularly if you're in a time sensitive situation. Whereas something like an ecosystem model is dedicated to creating those kind of information. So if you've got the time to create one, then it's a really good way of looking at it. And that's why it's always used for those kind of questions. So this is just a bit of a guide for people who are interested in going further about what works where. We have also tried to structure the table to show you the level of information and data required and time to development. So if you haven't got very much time, you might start with a conceptual model, whereas if you've got a year or a couple of years to before the answer is absolutely needed and you can work with people, then you can head for the end-to-end ecosystem modeling. And it really does take that long to pull a good model together. Next, please. So as Carl said in his introduction, I look a lot at complexity of putting things together. And this is from images from a paper called by Christensen and Skylar, looking at articulation is the level of complexity and effectiveness is how well the model performs. So the best way to think about a model complexity is the same way you think about a map. So if you've got a map of Vancouver, for instance, in the metro system, it's only got the level of detail that it needs to get you to the right spot. It's not trying to capture all the street structures. It's not going to capture all the cars on the road or people, because if you put in all of that detail, you're just as lost as you are in the real world. In model world, if you try to put in all that detail, you also got compounding errors. So you're just going to be off. It's not going to work very well. So that's the right-hand end of that plot. On the left-hand end, if you don't have enough information, it doesn't work very well either, because you haven't got the key connections and the feedbacks and the delays. So that boundary seems to be overly constrained by a couple of points. So if Billy presses down next, I can assure you that over the last 20 years, I've explored that whole space. Billy, have you got, I just need the bubble to turn up. Yep, thanks. You can see, so I didn't put all the dots on this point, but I can guarantee that I can fill out that space for you. So there really is that humped shape to it. So an intermediate complexity model, even if you're not making a pure mice model that we've talked about, but you're just making any kind of model, you're trying to find that sweet spot in the middle of enough detail that it can represent the key parts of the ecosystem and how they respond and the patterns that are generated when an ecosystem responds to change. But you don't necessarily want to get into infinite detail. You can't put in 18,000 species, for instance, not in a way that has meaningful connections. So that gets overloaded. Now, those models that have hit that sweet spot have the greatest potential to be right. That doesn't mean they are going to be right if they're not used in a thoughtful way. So a bad modeler can mess up a good model, basically. I can tell you this from experience because I've managed to numbnut myself quite a few times across the 20 years of doing ecosystem models. So it's always good to question yourself and question the model and figure out whether you really are doing things the right way. But if you keep in mind that you want to use it like a map, you want to get to the end location with just enough detail to get you there, then you're probably on the right track to putting it together, even if you have to look at that whole of system parts with all the human bits as well. So mathematically, that's a necessary but sufficient condition for any of the math geeks in the audience. Next, please. So the biggest piece of advice I can give you about making an ecosystem model is spend time thinking about it. Don't just leap in. As much as you might be driven to leap in, and I am a suck it and see person, I like pull things together and play with things to see if it works. But you always benefit from pausing a bit first and thinking about it. And even when you've got something going and you're putting things together, if it's starting to look like spaghetti, you've probably taken a step too far and you need to stop, pause, step back and think about do I really need all this complication, or is there a smarter way of doing it still to get the same outcome? And if you don't do that, you'll end up like the next figure. So yeah, that's how I spend a lot of my time. If you don't think about it first, you'll end up regretting it and having to spend a lot of time undoing your hard work. So all of that thought really helps. Next, please. So these are all the dimensions that you have to think about when you're trying to think about what you're going to put into an ecosystem model. There's the level of spatial resolution, the level of temporal resolution, whether it's days, months, years that you're worried about, the kind of processes, ecological processes and environmental processes you want to go put it in, whether it's going to work based on nitrogen and carbon or whether it's going to follow biomass. What kind of taxonomic resolution are you putting in? Are you basing it all on size? Or are you actually going to represent individual species, or are you going to have a combination of species or functional groups that are based on their role in the system, their size, where they live, what they eat, and then have some key species around them? Or and then you get into the same kind of questions around the human industries and how much detail you put into the human side of things, how you bound it. So unless you're going to model the entire world, which is beginning to be done now, or it has been done for the last few years, for most regional models that get used, you have to think about how you put an edge to that model, because that edge can influence the internal. So you need to think about all of those explicit parts, because you can't have fine detail on every one of those dimensions. It's like a big rubber sheet. You can pull it in one or two ways, but you can't pull it in all ways. It's just not going to work. So next, please, Billy. So if we just quickly step through the mental process of putting a model together. So let's just take Antarctica, next, Philly, and a spot in Antarctica in particular. So next, Philly. So you first think about the bathymetry of the system. You pull in that information. Next, Philly. Then you think about how you're going to chop up that space, whether you're going to use an approach that pulls out the key features in that system, like the shelf break there, and then where there's emergent islands next, or whether you want a regular grid. So humans can love the regular grid pictures. Most of the weather maps, for instance, are produced this way. We can conceptually understand it more easily when we chop it up in a grid, but it's not actually how the world works. And we don't usually have data for every one of those grid cells. So there is value in the polygon approach if you want to match the key scales and the key change points in an ecosystem, but it's not necessarily mentally easy for people to actually do. So, or actually interpret at the other end. So there is a bit of a trade-off there, even in the communication side of things. Next, please, Billy. In the same way, you need to think about time. So do you want to have one common time step through the whole model? And if so, what is it? It's going to be a month or a year. Or do you want to layer up different times for different processes? So do you want to have more detail about the time of the year when lots of things reproduce, and then just have one extra time step for the whole rest of the year? Do you want to layer up different times for different species? So it might be that your fine scale things like plankton and bacteria that have very short life scales have a few time steps for every one time step that a fish has. Or in the extreme, where you've got an individual based model, you might want to have large time steps when the animal's asleep and tiny time steps when it's running away from a predator. All of those kind of things are possible in models. So you do need to think about the time that you're stepping through, because then it influences how you set the parameters and how you set the other connections inside the model. Next, please. Then you start to pull in the information. So you start to layer in the bathymetry, and next, the sediments and the currents, and then next, the habitats, in this case, the ice flow structures. Next, then you start to layer in the biology and ecology. So that's that food web. You sort of plan out who's going to be in the food web, who's going to be a functional group. So in the middle there, I've got a group of fish all layered on top of each other. That's to represent a functional group where you combine different fish groups together. Other parts of that system are at an individual level, particularly the key species of conservation or fisheries concern. And then you can represent each part in a way that makes sense. So for some models, that'll be the same kind of equations for each part. Other models will break it up a bit in different ways. So next, please, Philly. For where you're trying to connect the very lowest part of the ecosystem to the highest part, you often find that The easiest way of doing that is to, in this case, we've got a polygonal structure rather than a grid, but however you make your spatial cells, you'll have just a biomass pool for your microfauna. You don't typically, there are some models that do play out agent-based approaches to plankton. That's a bit mind-bending. It's often easier just to have a biomass pool representation for the different classes of plankton. So you typically have a value per cell, but you can use some statistical methods to represent the internal patchiness within the cell. You don't always have to use those homogeneous smears. Next, please. Then you start to think about how you layer in the fish part. So in a model like Osmos, which is an agent-based approach for fish, or in vitro, what you do is you layer up schools that have of the same species and the same size structure or age structure typically, and then they follow their habitat and their diet, and they follow around where they want to go, and then where they overlap, they can interact. Next, please. Other approaches use size and age structures. So back to the spatial grid within each cell, there's the age and size structure of the different species, and then you can have interactions between those different species. You can also layer the two different models together. They don't have to be done independently. You can have agent-based and age-structured or size-structured models interconnected. Next, please. And one place that we often do that interconnection is around top predators. And that's where the identity of an individual, it turns out to be super important. And an example for anyone who's ever watched Ice Age 3, for instance, where the last female dodo falls over the cliff, it's really important that it was the last female. So that's an occasion where the demographics of the situation means that it would be good to be following the individuals, because the individual and its fate, its outcome, is really important for the overall system dynamics that's going to play out in the long term. It also allows you to have migrants move in and out of the system more easily. It works really well for top predators and large marine mammals. It's been used, and in Europe, they're increasingly using it for other animals, particularly the nightmare animal to model, which is salmon. Salmon, cephalopods, and crustaceans are really hard to model well. You can get there, but they can be a bit of a nightmare. Next one, please. So then you get into the human part. So it's not just the current human use, which is fine in a snapshot model, but if you're trying to have that bigger conditioning through time, you need to think about what was there in the past, what's planned in the future, and then think about the resolution that you want to bring in around that. How much detail? Do you just want to have a fishing mortality term, which is absolutely fine? You can structure those in a way that you can still use them to look at different kinds of fisheries, or you can get into more detail around how those fisheries or other processes work and what social or cultural drivers might be underlying them. Next, please. Then you start to bring in the government. So that's how the different users are interconnected, how they share their information, such as economic trading, but how, so there'll be some governance and regulatory pressure from social norms amongst the users, but there'll be other true regulations and policy. So next, please. And some of that can even bring in the politics, say, for instance, in the Southern Ocean, how the different nations even interact with each other. You can do that in a simple network representation or a random walk process. Next, please. And then you've got the management decision-making process so that you can play out the whole adaptive management cycle. Yep, next one, please. That seems like a lot to be putting in a model. So the key way to pull it all together is to think about that intermediate complexity I mentioned before. Don't put too much detail into everything. Think about where the critical feedbacks are. Allow yourself multiple ways of getting through the system. So there's different pathways through it, because it's the changing dominance of those different pathways that structure how the system plays out, the pictures that you see. So this is an actual slide inspired by something I saw Villy present. So I learned a lot of my modeling from Villy and Coll, despite what those guys say. And what they taught me, it's not about trying to draw every detail of the bird. It's about capturing the essence of the bird. So in that picture there, that artist has got, you can see it's a bird, but it's not all of the details. It's the essence of a bird. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get the essence of what's going on. And there's lots of different ways of capturing that essence. So that's the beautiful reason to use all the different kinds of models you can to see what you can get. the key part of capturing that essence is that you don't want to put in everything. You can't put in everything. An omission is perfectly possible, perfectly legitimate way of doing it. In fact, it's better to say, look, I don't have enough information, or I don't need to put in this particular group over here, because if you ram it in inappropriately, it actually screws up everything. So it doesn't work very well. You just need to be transparent about when you leave things out, because on occasion, that rare thing will be the thing that is actually important. And so the term Carl taught me was beware of vampires in the basement, because like in horror movies, they come out of nowhere and they get you. You can't necessarily anticipate every vampire and try to put it in the model, but you should be aware that they're there so that you're questioning your model and what it's doing to say, have I missed something that could be in the real world important, so that you can warn people about that even if you can't put it in the model. Next, please. That gets us onto how you handle uncertainty. So that's really important in these big system models, because you can't just take the engineering approach and play out every single parameter combination and see where it all ends up, because you would literally need longer than the universe has existed to do that. So that's obviously not going to be a sensible approach. So that's again why you have to have gone through that careful thinking approach to think about what you're covering. So there's two parts to uncertainty in an ecosystem model. One is around the parameters, and one is about how you put the different connections together. You actually need to think about both of those parts. So structural uncertainty is why you'd want to do different levels of complexity or different kinds of models to cover that kind of uncertainty. Whereas the parametric uncertainty is where you want to have multiple versions of each one of those models to make it tractable. And this is just an assumption that you're going to cover the uncertainty. Again, you could be hit by a vampire out of the basement, but if you try to aim for having one version of your model that is the most pessimistic version of the world, so highly vulnerable to disruption, slow to recover, you have one version of your model that's really optimistic, things are pretty robust, they're fast to recover. That's kind of the bookends. You create a version of your model that's in the middle that you think is the best representation of the system possible. Now that's the minimum n by n by n. So the 3 by 3 by 3, so 3 versions of the world by three different kinds of strategies that you might want to use to manage that world, and then 3 different scenarios of how that world might change. That's kind of the minimum set you'd want to understand the future and your options, but you can grow that in the number of dimensions. That's why it's n by n by n. That by doing it in that kind of way, you can start to say, well, look, I think I found the cloud of shapes represented by the dots in this thing, the cloud of shapes in each combination. So you're starting to give people insights. There are things you can bring over from weather forecasts and other kind of uncertainty handling to help you, but it is not a simple system, and particularly in communicating that. So you have to be able to communicate the uncertainty and be firm about communicating it, because they're just going to leap onto the most valuable number otherwise. But it's really important because people making decisions need to know whether you're confident about what you're saying or not, and where they need to be a bit more cautious. You also need to be able to say, look, if I could just have information on this part here, it could wipe out all of that uncertainty. We'd be far more certain about what's going on. You do actually also have to realize the more information you get, the more you suddenly realize you didn't know. So it doesn't always reduce uncertainty to increase the information you have, but you're then more certain about what you don't know, which ironically actually puts you in a better position. And next, please. So one way of dealing with this is called management strategy evaluation, and this kind of tool is available in Ecopath with Ecosim. In Atlantis, it's used with Osmos. A lot of the models are now used in this way, and that's where you use the ecosystem model to play out the whole adaptive management cycle. So you have how the ecological and the natural world works in blue. You have how it's exploited by the industry. You have the forces on the industry, and then you have the management and assessment cycle steps, how the data is collected, how decisions made, how that feeds back and shifts how the industry responds. You can have more or less detail in every part of that. So some models put a lot into the physical world and less into the human world. You can put equal attention on both sides. But the important part is you've got all of those feedback loops involved, because then you can play out the different decisions. Now, I've just talked a lot about uncertainty, and you think, oh my God, how can you do that kind of stuff with all of that uncertainty? Well, there's a whole bunch of decision theory, so a whole bunch of mathematics around decisions. That so as long as you have the same biases and uncertainties when you compare the different options, the ranking of those options is pretty spot on, even if you can't be very precise or certain about the outcomes of any one option. So what you're trying to do is use your model as a make-believe world to play out the options, because if they don't work well in that world, they're unlikely to work well in the more complicated real world. So you're trying to filter out ones. So if we think of the little table down on the left-hand side there, we're not after an optimal solution. What we're after is a solution that just to know when something is never going to work. So that's the column that's all red. It's equally dangerous in a way to have a situation where it works really well in some circumstances and really poorly in others. So the one where there's some green and red, and I'm sorry to the colorblind people in the audience. And the reason that it's really important to know that is you're not always sure which of those states that you're in. So that can be equally dangerous. Or equally dangerous in the sense if you're only pleasing some people and other people are really opposed to it, because you're not likely to get a sustainable outcome through time that way either, because it'll get undermined. What you're actually looking for is what in Australia would call minimum sustainable wins. So it works in pretty much all situations. It's not super perfect in any one situation, but it's not catastrophic in other situations. It's keeping everybody happy to some degree. No one's necessarily overwhelmingly happy, but no one's really pissed off either. So that kind of solution is your win-win. Everybody's had their objectives met, and it's not going to go cactus when something changes. That kind of thing is probably the best you're going to get in an ecosystem. So you're really happy when you find that kind of outcome, which is the middle yellow one in that management table. Next, please. So once you've got your models together, you can run out your different outcomes, and that's when you get to the management table, often presented with these kinds of graphs and plots, or the kind of decision table that we saw before, or increasingly in our experience, and it could just be in Australia where you haven't had to have mathematics to graduate high school for the last 20 years, we're actually using animators to animate little movies about what the different worlds could look like. But to help people understand at a systems level how that all plays out, because we've found that it's very hard for them to take in lots of plots and data. So you actually need to, and that was somewhat inspired again by the stuff that Billy and Carl have done with their immersion lab and the stuff they've played with around with Jerome. Next, please. So in terms of what we can cover, and what's out there, we now understand. So this is a plot in time and space of all the different kinds of processes. You can see that the central spine, the diagonal of that plot, is actually comes from oceanography, and it's pulling out the different processes and scales that things happen. So that there's a ridge where the ridges where the most common things happen, and you can see that's a diagonal there across different kinds of ecosystems, different kinds of physical processes. Next, please. Similarly, when you get into the kinds of large-scale environmental processes, like the things to do with the climate or things to do with predator and prey, it's again across that diagonal that most of the things that we understand or realize are happening are coming into play. And you can see the evolution though is changing and pushing down into smaller scales on this plot. There's an arrow there. Next, please. Equally into the land side of things and the disasters that can happen there. Again, we're on a diagonal, and it's important to think about what can be happening on the land side of things, because that can influence what happens in the ocean. I don't have time to go into that, but just take my word on it that the two are very strongly interconnected. Next, please. So once we get to I think the human one is next. Yes, you'll see that humans ram themselves up into one quadrant of that space. They're not as spread out across that space, at least in the things that we think about when we're talking about ecosystem models. Next, please. In terms of what we can monitor, which I think is the next one. There's a bit of a delay here in Tasmania. Okay, so you can see that we covered that space pretty well in how we can sample it. We even cover spaces that people probably don't need much on because they come for free when we're covering the bits we care about. There are parts that we don't cover well. There's a gap there between the satellite area and the isotope area, but in the main part we can now cover with data collection all the different scales that are important for informing ecosystem models. But you can see from that you're going to have to pull together a lot of different data scales, data types, to cover all of the scales that you need. Next, please. Now, in terms of modelling, the different kinds of models are the yellow dots up the spine of that model there. They're models written for different purposes, but if you chain them together, we can get an understanding across that key central spine of the model, and we're starting to push the area out. So that's why the amoeba has little arrows on the edge of it. The current development pushes are up towards areas that the managers care about, but interestingly enough, not all in where they care about. There's also some areas that we just probably won't ever have much interest in because they're either completely unpredictable or they're so predictable that you can take it as read that you know the answer is going to be. But interestingly enough, there's still a lot of space for development and getting better at the scales that managers actually care about. We really only cover about half of the scales they care about in a way that they care about right now. So there's plenty of gaps still to fill. Next, please, Villy. And so in the other paper that you're set to, that we tried to summarize all of the things that we saw were issues now, what was driving that, and what were the next steps. So the first class is around the data that you've got. Next, please, Villy. So in terms of the data available in making these ecosystem models, it's hard to get it in the past. It's not much there. We have patchy data. So all the blue space, basically the green, yellow, and red dots on this picture, again, my apologies to anyone who's colorblind, cover where there's lots of data. You can see there's an awful lot of the ocean where there's no data. Next, please, Philly. And that make it more complicated, fish move around. So data is going to be an eternal problem when you're trying to put an ecosystem models about. So historically, that's been around too little data on things that we actually need information on. Next, please, Villy. And the new problem with data is, yes, there's all these new methods to bring data together, but it's amazingly difficult to do. It's like a fire hose has just hit you in the face. We're getting all of this new data and we don't really know how to use it well. So that will improve over the coming decades. And we can tease out new understanding from that, but we're going to have to deal with data in a whole new way. We can potentially get to a place where models start to be auto-assembled. They're doing that in the plankton and the the near real-time oceanographic modeling already. It'll take us some time to get there with the ecosystem models, I think, but it creates a new challenge of filtering out the useful information from the sheer volume of information. Next, please. So the next band of things that were of concern is how you actually understand what needs to go into the model in the first place. There's often not enough time to go into huge amount, 20-year career of understanding uncertainty if you're just trying to build a model for someone. So trying to understand what are the key processes to include. So next, please, Philly. Thankfully, there are some things that we do understand. So if this is based on a geological paper, so they do axes a bit back to what you might expect. So the most recent period of time is actually on the right-hand end of this plot, and the data through time on temperature and pH has come from things like ice cores and things like that. Next, please, Villy. You'll notice that at the end, there's the solid dots, and that's the open dots are data and the solid dots are projection. So we're about to kick, or we are kicking the world out of a place it's been in 60 to 70 million years, and we've added 6 billion people to the planet in doing that. We have another couple of billion to go. So we've supercharged the system. So processes that we used to be able to think were pretty slow, like evolution, now happen at really fast paces. And the mathematical tricks that we used to be able to use to describe the world are breaking down pretty quickly. So equilibrium assumptions and things like that can still be useful guidance, particularly for year-to-year decisions, but they're not great for projecting into the future for those strategic decisions. So we have to think about new scales and new processes in our models so that we can still be giving appropriate advice. Next, please. So there's a whole bunch of things that help with that non-linearity, as it's called. And that's, you appreciate the common backbone of how different systems work, and then you need to pull in the specific quirks for a particular system. In particular, we need to think about how evolution plays out in a system, how the physiology, the habitat interplays, and that's things that people haven't really thought about before. And we have to get over our obsession with predation. So majority of the ecological literature is obsessed with predation, prey structuring interactions, but there's other things like commensalism, amensalism, and particularly parasitism that can also restructure things. So if you think in your own personal body, it's actually your gut flora that has the biggest impact on your mental health, for instance. So the part of your body that's not actually literally you, it's all the microbes that live in your gut, has a huge influence on how your brain works. Now, that doesn't seem to be obvious straight out of the box. It did have to be teased out. And in much the same way, the parasites in a system can structure who's eating who's interacting with who, on what time scales and what spatial scales. So we need to start paying a bit more attention as systems change so quickly to these influences that we hadn't thought about before. And that's because we're starting to see regime shifts and non-linear change. And so the picture on the left-hand side, sorry, right-hand side there, shows a hysteresis. It's a comic version of a hysteresis and how a system can change, because it can change very quickly in one way and have to go a completely different route to recover, if it ever even looks the same anymore under climate change. But it's that dynamic nature and allowing parameters and even the structures of models to change dynamically. So I talked about before how you could have a hybrid model that had different ways of representing different parts of an ecosystem or different parts of a life history, but we're also working on models that naturally morph as the situation requires. So it might be a differential equation for most of the time when it's in a steady state or a nice sort of eddy structure, but when it hits something like an oil spill or a big oxygen deprivation zone where the identity of who's interacting with that zone is really important, it could break down to an individual based model. Out the other side, come together using statistical processes to give you a distribution of who was impacted in what way, and then into partial differential equation models to take it forward and allow the model itself to morph as needed. That's a fairly new area, but it shows a lot of potential. So, and it's becoming to be needed because you get very different answers if you assume the old version of the world versus a dynamic representation in projecting forward over the next 50 years. Next, please, Villy. Thankfully, there are things like traits and size-based structures that I talked about that do seem to be able to represent quite a lot of processes in the picture. Network theory is introducing a lot of concepts and indices that we can use. Simply looking at the structure of the network of a system can give you its vulnerability to collapse, for instance, and what are the key parts of the system to protect, to make sure it doesn't collapse, and those kind of insights. There's also a whole bunch of complexity and systems theory that you can pull in. And one of the key lessons that I learned actually at UBC in my PhD was sitting in Carl's office. And he pointed to an equation on the board and said, "What's that?" And I'd said, "Which one of these equations is the most complex versus the most complicated?" So when you're trying to pull an ecosystem together, you want complex. You want things that can generate disconnects, nonlinear interactions, and emergent behavior. You don't want complicated where you're just layering on line by extra line by extra line and extra term in a very hardwired linear way. That's not going to reproduce an ecosystem. So that's getting back to how you represent the essence of the bird with this new ecological knowledge that we have. Next, please. And so that's where you get into those hybrid models and pulling in information from different disciplines. So for instance, I work with 75 different disciplines now, from knowledge coming from traditional elders through psychology, ecology, oceanography, a whole bunch of different things. But you can learn from all of those in pulling things together, particularly to get into those dynamic parts. Next, please. So in summary, and I've probably taken too long to describe this to you, but maths is an amazingly powerful tool to pull together a picture of an ecosystem. We can obviously live with ecosystems, we live within them all the time, but we're not necessarily smart enough without those support tools to unpick how they work and then think about how they work into the future. So we do need those maths tools to help us as a crutch. The challenges include the data scales that we have, the uncertainty around them, the complexity in communicating them, but fixes exist. So thinking through things carefully, bringing in your computer power, the new kind of modeling tools that are out there. But if you can always aim for that Goldilocks area where you're capturing the key feedbacks, where you're using different models to get different points of view on the thing, and then you can be most certain about the patterns that you generate, not necessarily the exact values you generate, but the patterns and how they rank versus each other. That's the most useful information that you can give to people. Thanks. Oops.